Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Duncan Brown, and I am a trustee with the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs. I hope this webinar finds all of those tuned in safe and well. And before I introduce Ambassador DeThomas, a few quick announcements regarding logistics for tonight's webinar. We are using the Zoom webinar platform tonight, so everyone is automatically muted and will stay muted for the duration. Additionally, the only persons you should see on your screen will be myself or Ambassador DeThomas. Questions tonight will be handled through the Q&A function in Zoom. The Q&A button should be located on the bottom of your screen. Just click on the button, type in your question, select goes to everyone, and hit submit. At the end of Ambassador DeThomas's prepared remarks, I will consolidate the questions and relay them to him. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs YouTube website within about 2 weeks. Ambassador DeThomas will speak for about 40 minutes, at which point we will conduct the Q&A. And now to tonight's speaker. Ambassador Joseph DeThomas is a professor of practice at the School of International Affairs at the Pennsylvania State University. He was a member of the U.S. Foreign Service for 29 years and worked at the U.S. State Department for 32 years. His service abroad included 2 tours in Iran, Germany, Mexico, Ethiopia, and Austria. He was also the U.S. Ambassador to Estonia from 2001 to 2004. He also held numerous positions in Washington over the course of 3 decades. This included 2 years of service as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Non-Proliferation from 1999 to 2001, as well as a number of other positions that dealt primarily with nuclear proliferation in sensitive countries. This included serving as Deputy Head of Delegation for Negotiations with North Korea from 1999 to 2000. After retiring from government service in 2006, Ambassador DeThomas directed international science engagement and threat reduction programs in more than 20 countries at a corporation called CRDF Global. He then returned to service in the State Department from 2010 to 2013 as an advisor. There he worked primarily on North Korea and Iran, implementing sanctions and attempting to impede weapons of mass destruction efforts in the 2 countries. Ambassador DeThomas received his BA and his MA from the Pennsylvania State University, and he holds an MPA from Harvard's John Kennedy School of Government. He is also a distinguished graduate of the U.S. National War College. Please join me in giving a warm, albeit virtual, welcome to Ambassador DeThomas. And over to you, sir.
Thank you, Duncan. Always a pleasure to work with you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for having me in your homes. I hope you are doing well during this very odd year. I'd like to talk to you tonight about North Korea, and my subtitle is What Now? And for those of us who have worked on North Korea, that's an expression we've said a lot. What now? We've had a really revolutionary presidential term for North Korea policy. And we now have to think about what the next term will offer us and what our status is today and what our next term will offer. First, obviously, the problem. The problem is pretty clear. North Korea has a nuclear weapons and intercontinental ballistic missile program. It is making considerable progress in those programs and has made considerable progress, particularly since about 2015. Here are some of the very basic facts. First, and the one that's probably got the most attention these days, is they've tested missiles now with a range to strike perhaps all, but certainly part of the continental United States. They haven't tested the reentry vehicle, which is an important technical point, but the missiles have the range now to hit American targets. Equally important, they have a 30-year-old nuclear weapons design and production program. And they've tested what we believe to have been a thermonuclear device with a yield of about perhaps 200 kilotons, somewhere between 170 and 370, so 200 kilotons, which is a good 10 times the nominal yield of the Hiroshima bomb and considerably more than 10 times of its real yield. They have produced over the course of this 30 years, maybe 30 to 50 fission weapons. So Hiroshima-style size weapons. That could be up to 60 now, but 30 to 50 is a safe range to talk about. And perhaps more important, if you think about the region, the East Asian region, they have over 1,000 shorter range nuclear capable missiles, which means that they've got the ability to hit targets in East Asia, Japan, South Korea, all of our military bases in the area, all of our embarkation or disembarkation points for any potential war in Korea. So from a military point of view, those shorter range missiles are quite important. Okay, oops, gotta flick my slides there. Now, given that rather grim assessment, the US government has thought a lot about this problem, but it hasn't really had a good information base to think about it. And what that has done is produce a lot of confusion about the purpose of this program, of these programs. And you know, that speculation tends to be driven ideologically. So if you come from the school that views the Kim Jong-un and his ancestors' regime as just utterly crazy and violent, then you're going to have one set of policy issues. If you believe they are rational and defensive, you have another set of problems and solutions. If you believe they're rational and military aggressive, you got another set, and rational and politically aggressive, another. Or, and this is a view held by a lot of people in the United States government, are they just extortionate? I mean, had they produced really the tools for a protection racket? Are they just going to sell this for the right price? Now, each of these approaches has advocates in the United States government, and they vary at times. The middle one is sort of a Pentagon view. Probably the fourth one, rational and politically aggressive, is frequently the State Department view. But we had an entire administration, the George W. Bush administration, that started from the premise that they were just crazy and violent. They were a rogue state. They couldn't be deterred. Therefore, there really was very little you could do to deal with them other than overthrow them. So all of these have a view. I'll give you my view later. But what it produces is a big variation in policy prescriptions. This is just sort of how that sort of sorts out. I mean, if you believe they're irrational, what you fear is the unprovoked attack on the American homeland. That Kim Jong-un wakes up one morning, says, they said something bad about me on CNN and I'm going to punish them. If you believe they're defensive, even if you believe they're defensive, you still have problems because they violated the non-proliferation treaty. They've broken all kinds of UN sanctions, and they are prone to transfer these weapons to others. If you believe they're militarily aggressive, you fear conventional aggression. You can imagine easily an aggressive North Korea using its nuclear weapons as a shield behind which it could take aggressive conventional actions. They could, for example, do something at the DMZ and then just sit there and stare across the DMZ and say, oh, you want to respond? We've got nuclear weapons. Is it worth the cost? If they're politically aggressive, you could use them to decouple our allies. You could put threats before the South Koreans or Japanese and lever them away from our alliance. That's particularly worrisome if you believe North Korea has nuclear weapons that can target American cities. Our allies may not believe we're willing to trade Los Angeles for Osaka, for example, or Los Angeles for Seoul. Then there you could have a risk of alliance decoupling on that basis. And finally, the extractive one produces, I think, some of our big errors in policy because it assumes that they're just willing to sell this program to us for a price. All we've got to figure out is how many zeros to put on behind the number on the check. And this, I think, we have seen this even very recently. And I think that probably doesn't capture North Korean motivations entirely. They are an extractive regime. They view foreigners basically as very large ATMs, even their friends. But I think to think they solely have this nuclear weapons program to sell it is going to produce a bad policy result. Okay, before we can look forward and before we can look at the present, we really do have to look back because you can't really understand either where the North Koreans are coming from or where I think they're coming from, at least, without looking at their past. Now, this is an old North Korean propaganda poster about the Korean War. And here are the rapacious, evil Americans in North Korea dropping North Korean babies down wells. And all right, it's propaganda, but it's propaganda that has now gone on for 69 years. The Korean War was very traumatic in North Korea. That place was carpet bombed flat. It was invaded by foreign armies up and down the peninsula. Everybody in North Korea lost someone. Everybody, including civilians, very large civilian casualties. So it was a very traumatic event. People can't look at the United States except through the lens of a lot of propaganda that's flowed from that war. Here's another lesson of history. These are headlines and a picture of Muammar Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein. And if you sit where the North Korean regime sits, and you look at the United States from there, you do not see the caricature of American policy that many people in the United States see. We are not this sort of benign, bumbling superpower that never really puts its power to use properly. We're always being frustrated by the bad guys. This is what they see. When you get on the wrong side of the United States as a regime, you disappear personally. So their lesson of history is these are two guys who got on the wrong side of the United States and for various reasons gave up their nuclear weapons programs. And after they gave them up, the Americans offed them. So from a North Korean perspective, when they think about denuclearizing, these are the headlines they see. And that's one of the things you've got to cope with if you're dealing with the North Korean regime. Okay, how would I characterize North Korea's relationship with the world in general, not just the United States? And I use this. The North Korea is a dog in a world of wolves. It's a regime and a people with a history of foreign invasion and foreign domination. Its neighbors have constantly invaded it, occupied it, colonized it, used it as an invasion route. It's surrounded by bigger, richer, more powerful nations. And throw us in because we're in the region, so we're neighbors in that sense. And North Korea's response has been consistently to be so mean, so vicious, that even the wolves are going to stay away because, yes, the wolves will kill it, but it's going to take a big chunk out of them. It's going to hurt them. And they make it not worth the price. So any interchange with North Korea is going to start painfully and with a lot of snarling. And beyond that, one thing North Korea has learned is that it can't stand up, certainly, when all of its neighbors collude. Lots of North Korean histories about the big neighbors making deals and the Koreans paying the price. So divide and conquer with the neighbors and the US is a fundamental piece of North Korean diplomacy. And as we'll get to later, in 2018, we saw really a masterclass on divide and conquer by the North Koreans. Usually they're fairly ham-handed about it, but in 2018, they really did a good job with this. So what can you expect when you deal with North Korea? They're going to be mean, and they're going to act as if they're ready to fight at any second. But behind that, what you need to understand is they fear the world. I'm leaving ideology out of it. I'm not leaving the nature of the regime out of it. Just because they feel the world is hostile, and they have a history to prove it, they are acting out of an attempt to put their more powerful neighbors on the back foot. Now, let's start from there when we talk about nuclear weapons. Kim Jong-un, in particular, genuinely believes that the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, can only be safe from a U.S. regime-changing attack if it can target the U.S. with nuclear weapons. It needs a nuclear deterrent to keep us from pulling a Saddam Hussein on them. It also believes that most of its other big diplomatic problems, like sanctions, will be resolved once it can prove that it has us deterred, that we will negotiate away sanctions in order to buy safety somehow. So that's the North Korean approach. Now that's really at cross purposes with where most of the US national security elite is. And this is bipartisan in nature. I use the Trump administration here, but I could have used the Obama administration, frankly. The Trump administration, certainly prior to the summit, so until April of 2018 or so, genuinely believed that if the DPRK finished its ICBM program and could target the US with nuclear weapons, all was lost. These guys were not deterrable. And so the US would have to act militarily, if necessary, to prevent them from completing the task. This is, I think, again, this is sort of repetitive here, combined with the DPRK fear that if it denuclearized, we would do a Libya or a Saddam Hussein on it, but also by a US fear that any negotiated deal would unravel because the North Koreans would pocket any concessions and then just go back to their program clandestinely. So what you've got then is a real set of national security objectives that are at bad cross purposes. On the one hand, you've got the DPRK racing toward obtaining a nuclear deterrent against the United States, and the US believing once they get there, preventative war is the only answer. And that's where we were at the end of 2017. We were in a very difficult point. We'll talk about that just in a moment. So US policy. And this is not a new problem. Every president since George H.W. Bush has addressed it. And if you've lived through all of those administrations, and I've lived all of them except the Trump administration, it looks like a rinse and repeat cycle. We discover something about the North Korean program. We have to act against it, and we put pressure on the North Koreans to do something, or we come up with a diplomatic initiative to do something. Things build up toward a crisis, and then there's some kind of resolution that looks like it's put this thing to bed, and then it unravels for either US policy reasons or DPRK policy reasons. So sort of rinse and repeat, sort of a nice sine wave of, of crisis and then resolution, crisis and then resolution. And during it, all that time, the North Korean nuclear weapons program advances. So that we end up with the sine wave sort of with escalating problems at the end. And this really came to a head in 2017. At the time, I wrote an article which was entitled "The Lamps Are Going Out in Asia," because I felt we were very much on the road to a repeat of the start of World War I. That two sides were at cross purposes. We both, our optimal outcome was the absolute nightmare of the other side, and both sides were sort of taking us to a place where war was going to be the only option. I based that on the extremely heated public rhetoric and some very real military preparations, as well as some of the information I was seeing from abroad, particularly from China. And now with Bob Woodward's recent book, we can see that in fact, inside the United States government and inside the North Korean government, they too were preparing for war. There were a series of military provocations and incidents that were taking us to that place. And at the very top of the US government, they were really thinking that war over the North Korean missile program was going to be the outcome. Now, that sort of got the whole dynamic sort of had a revolutionary shift at the end of 2017. The end of 2017, there was a big North Korean peace offensive that culminated in the Singapore summit that you saw a picture of there. Now, how did we get to that point? From about March of 2016 until the end of 2017, so under both the Obama and the Trump administrations, the United States managed to engineer full economic sanctions on North Korea for the first time, real hard-hitting economic sanctions. These, by the end of 2017, literally brought the DPRK's legal foreign trade to zero. We basically ended their access to hard currency, at least on the legal market. At the same time, the DPRK was doing a lot of long-range missile tests, and was even talking about doing a long-range missile test that would detonate a nuclear weapon in the atmosphere, perhaps over a U.S. Military base. And the U.S. was taking not very well publicized, but very real military actions in response. Every time the U.S. had good intelligence about when North Korea was going to launch its tests, and every time it launched a missile, we launched a tactical missile in South Korea with exactly the range to the test pad, basically sending the signal that if we don't like where these missiles look like they're going to go, we're taking you out. We were also conducting Air Force exercises that looked an awful lot like training for a large-scale air attack on North Korea. We were sending signals that we would do, we would go after leadership in an attack as well. Both the South Koreans and particularly the Chinese feared this was going off the rails. The Chinese at the time were sending messages out publicly and privately, and some of them were, I'm quoting one now. It said, the United States and North Korea are two trains going at high speed in opposite directions on the same track. They're going to crash. And they were very worried about it. Now, that had one beneficial effect. The Chinese were so worried that this was going to end up in a war on their border that they, for the first time, actually enforced heavily UN sanctions. Thus, the DPRK's trade going to zero. The Chinese were tightening the noose, and the North Koreans were furious about it. So things were tough for Kim Jong-un at this point. It looked to him like he was either going to end up in a fatal war for him, or he's going to get his economy crushed. So on New Year's Eve, he issues a speech, his big formal speech on New Year's Eve, and it's a peace speech. During it, he accepts the ROK's invitation to attend the Olympics. He then sends his sister to head the North Korean delegation to the Olympics, and she charms the South Korean media and the international media, for that matter. In subsequent meetings with the South Koreans, he issues a summit invitation to Donald Trump. And Trump, breaking with all past precedent, accepts immediately through the South Koreans. Now, there had been lots of effort to get to a summit with North Korea. I was part of one of those in the Clinton administration. We were very close to getting to a summit. But a summit for us was something you did at the end of the deal. We got very close. We didn't get there by the end of the Clinton administration. This was sort of turning that on its head. This basically said, in order to get to a deal, we need a summit. We're going to skip all the working level stuff and move to the top. And that produced not only 2 summits, but about 27 so-called love letters between Trump and Kim, some of which are detailed in Bob Woodward's book. And these letters are, there is some substance that you have to be able to decode out of them, but they're largely kind of mood music. There's a lot of effort by Kim to charm Trump, a lot of effort by Trump to build a friendship with Kim, personal friendship. And the whole idea clearly from both leaders' perspective was the 2 great men can get together and direct top down a solution to our problems. Now, I'm being a little facetious about it, but that's not a bad idea. That's not a bad idea in principle. So we went from near war to the most radical effort to make peace between North Korea and the United States ever in the space of a few months. Well, the first summit took place in Singapore, and it produced a summit statement. It did not produce an agreement. It produced a joint statement. And this is all of the substances. These are the words of the joint summit statement from Singapore. And I want to go through this a little bit because it's really important that we understand what the 2 sides see here and how that gets us in trouble. And this is done in the order of the statement. First thing in the statement is the United States and North Korea commit to establish new US-DPRK relations in accordance with the desire of the peoples of the 2 countries for peace and prosperity. Diplomatic recognition. We're talking here about diplomatic recognition. We're going to agree, step 1, to recognize North Korea, have embassies. Number 2, the United States and the DPRK will join their efforts to build a lasting and stable peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. We want to sign a peace treaty to end the Korean War. So those are the first two things, diplomatic relations leading then to a peace treaty, ending the Korean War formally. Step number 3, and here's where you got to read carefully. Reaffirming the April 27th, 2018 Panmunjom Declaration. That's the South Korea, North Korea summit that took place before Singapore. The DPRK commits to, quote, work towards complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. This does not say we are going to give up our nuclear weapons as a first step or even as a second step. What this says in North Korean language is we agree to negotiate about the denuclearization of, and now this is the key, the Korean Peninsula, not North Korea. That means both North and South and the alliance that South Korea has with us, a nuclear weapons state. So in North Korean diplomacy, when they say the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, they're talking about not only they getting rid of nuclear weapons, but South Korea losing its access to the American nuclear deterrent. And since from the North Korean perspective, the American nuclear deterrent is comes along with any US military, they're talking about somehow or other removing US military involvement in South Korea. Maybe not immediate evacuation of troops, but somehow or other, we've got to have an entirely different security structure in the Korean Peninsula. So what we're negotiating about in North Korean words is something very different from let's just give up our nuclear weapons. The fourth point is really just the North Korea, it's a sweetener the North Koreans always offer at the time when our relations are getting better. It's helping us recover POW and MIA remains from the Korean War, from North Korea. It's something that we feel very strongly about. It's always something of value to us because we have a commitment to our families, that the survivors. And by the way, the North Koreans make money hand over fist from this. That's a fourth sweetener point. It doesn't have much to do with the big picture. Now, the order matters. This is a North Korean order. First, you recognize us. Second, we make peace. Then we'll talk about our nuclear weapons. So I remember when the summit happened, I looked at that and I said, I hope there's another document because this isn't enough for us to do things. This is going to be a long, hard haul to get what we want out of this deal. Nothing there is bad. Certainly, one of the things we have to hope for is that any kind of solution to the problem in Korea leads to a peace treaty and it leads to diplomatic relations. These are not things we should say, oh no, they should never have those. But you got to remember, how you get there is going to matter. And whether you're ever going to get to point 3, if you've given up 1 and 2 already, maybe if the mood is right, it could happen, but it's a lot less likely. So that's where the fizzle comes from. The second summit ended with a U.S. walkout from the, sorry, I just hit a button by mistake. From the point of view of Kim, this was a shock. This was a shock. He did not expect the summit to fall apart like this. He didn't think we were anywhere near an impasse. And they were shocked, and the U.S. was shocked that the North Koreans weren't ready to make a deal. The quote here, he was not ready to make a deal, is directly from President Trump. He said that is why he walked. It was clear that Kim wasn't ready to make a deal. The deal being, give up all your nuclear weapons right now, step 1. That's what his deal was. That clearly Kim was never going to be willing to do. So there was a basic misunderstanding here that I'll talk about in a moment. So throughout this negotiating process, getting ready for the summits, the U.S. was putting on the table before the North Koreans that full denuclearization and transparency had to be done in one bite. It had to be done quickly. I mean, when Secretary Pompeo went to Pyongyang to set up the first summit, what he asked for was a list of all North Korean nuclear weapons and where they were located as the first step. So don't worry about coming to an agreement with us. Give us what we want now. Tell us where everything is. And that didn't succeed, of course. It's why Pompeo isn't a very welcome person in North Korea anymore. It was the assumption that we kept having about this. The North Koreans offered less than satisfactory offer in Hanoi. What they offered, not small, but it wasn't enough, was a phased approach. We would give up the big sanctions that had been passed by the UN since March of 2016 in the first go. And in return, North Korea would shut down its main nuclear research center at Yongbyon. Now, that's not small potatoes. There are a lot of facilities there. There's a uranium enrichment plant there. There's a research reactor that produces plutonium there. So it's not a small thing, but it's certainly not the whole thing. It's only a one piece of a larger puzzle. As soon as the U.S. basically walked from that agreement, she said, no, it didn't say, oh, no, we don't want that. We want something, we want your deal plus 4. No, they just, no, we're either going to do the full transparency and the full denuclearization at this meeting, or we're walking. Both sides were shocked. About the other side, I don't know why they were. They shouldn't have been shocked in either side. They weren't listening to each other, apparently. Before I get to this, I'm gonna shift up here one slide, because this is where we are now. I mean, summitry's over at least until after the election. There isn't. The North Koreans have said point blank, we're not going to negotiate anymore. There's nothing to talk about. We're going to keep working on our deterrent. We'll see you next year, essentially. What that will mean will depend on the election, of course. But what do we do now? What do we do if we're going to deal with this problem? North Korea is probably going to, in the next year or two, be able to have a reentry vehicle that can reach the United States with a nuclear weapon. Well, there's bad and catastrophic. There are bad solutions and there are catastrophic solutions. There aren't any good solutions at this point. We've basically run out of good solutions. The one a lot of people talk about is military. Let's remove their nuclear program. There isn't a surgical strike ability here. You can't do this surgically for 2 reasons. One is we don't know where everything is, and a lot of it's buried and it's mobile. So the probability that you're going to get everything, short of a first nuclear strike, is pretty low. Second, the regime will respond. They will fight. And so then you're going to have a major Korean war no matter what. And so you'll lose 1 million Koreans, if nothing else, and a lot of American military families and military men and women. So a military solution is doable, but just at a tremendous price. Tremendous price. Regime change. That's the one way I could be certain that North Korea will give up its nuclear weapons, is if its regime is changed and a regime is put in that wants to get rid of nuclear weapons. Great. It's a solution that would work. How are you going to do it? I don't have any idea how you can change that regime. It should have died 20 years ago by any rational calculation of a state that that's failed. North Korea was a failed state. It hasn't changed the regime. The regime has not collapsed. So I don't know how you do change the regime. And I think we're kidding ourselves if we think we can do it with resolutions or sanctions on human rights violators. I don't see it ever happening. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen by surprise. It's not going to be because we thought up a way to do it. Diplomacy, again, like every administration has tried. Yes, but in what way and for what purpose? We will need a diplomatic channel if we're ever going to resolve this issue or at least stabilize it. But are you going to be coercive? Are you going to focus on sanctions or other coercive means, or persuasive? Are you going to offer benefits in return? Are you going to make concessions of some kind? This is certainly where the Trump administration ended, with persuasive diplomacy being their main way of doing it, while believing they had a lot of sanctions pressure on North Korea that would leverage them towards saying yes. We can talk about that in Q&A, perhaps, about whether sanctions are a reasonable approach to getting us where we need to go. And finally, the one nobody in the United States wants to talk about is containment. This is not the first country that's pointed nuclear weapons at us. Certainly, Russia and the Soviet Union have pointed nuclear weapons at us since 1949. We've managed to survive that. China has a growing nuclear weapons program, and it's had nuclear weapons pointed at us since 1964. And it was as crazy a state as you could name when it first got nuclear weapons. Yet, we found ways to not only survive that, but conduct very productive diplomacy and make changes in relationships to our benefit. So some form of deterrence and containment is a possibility. It's just one that kind of sticks in our craw because the North Koreans violated a treaty. They've cheated on agreements with us, and we don't really want to have to live with it. We want justice. Justice is a tough thing to come by in diplomacy. Okay, so this is just saying what I said before. First of all, we had stable deterrence on the peninsula for 50 years. North Korea didn't need nuclear weapons pointed at Los Angeles to deter us from a Korean war that was going to be ruinously expensive, even though we would have won it. We didn't have to do very much more than we've already done to deter North Korea, because North Korea knows perfectly well that the Second Korean War ends them. They know that. They're not fools. They know, and they've known for 20 or 30 years, that a Second Korean War is the end of their regime and of their country. Deterrence is conceivable and possible with current military capabilities. But if you want to change North Korea's current setup, you got to fight a big war. And it used to be called the Million, Billion, Trillion War by our commanders there, because it was going to cost 1 million lives and do $1 trillion worth of damage. We had a credible military threat during 2017. Trump had ratcheted up the rhetoric so high that a lot of people genuinely believed war was possible. So during that period of time, our military threat was at least a good lever for diplomacy. Unfortunately, symmetries killed that military threat. Nobody believes today that the United States is ready to go to war over North Korean missiles. You can't just undo all the symmetry, all the love letters, all the press. You just can't reverse field that fast in the world. So we don't have a credible military threat today to trade on. Diplomatic, I just want to say about one thing: goals. The problem we have is we have a maximal goal, which is the complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization of North Korea. Now, to me, at this point in time, that is a dream, not a goal. I would love to get there. I can't get you there. I can't get you there short of war. And that's what we learned in the summit process. We did everything we could in the summit process to get this. The North Koreans weren't ready to bite for reasons we've already discussed. So we have a maximal goal, and I don't think we have a way to get to the maximal goal in one bite, at least. Sanctions are part of this, but our maximum pressure campaign, where we really did hurt the North Koreans, died in April of 2018. Because at that point, the Chinese were much more interested in fostering the diplomatic engagement and in winning back North Korean attention, because what they were afraid of was the North Koreans were going to go so far over the edge in making friends with Donald Trump that they would lose their client state. They weren't prepared to do that, so they got in a bidding war with us, and they had an awful lot more to offer than we did in the immediate future. Therefore, the Chinese stopped enforcing sanctions, and we lost maximum pressure. I give the Trump administration praise for trying symmetry. There was a chance that a top-down agreement could produce something. I give them a dunce cap for how they did it. They did not have a very well done, well thought through negotiating strategy. They were too divided internally and too chaotic in how they did their business. And what they produced, therefore, was a fizzle. Now, where does that leave us diplomatically? Well, where it leaves me is expecting the North Koreans are going to offer a welcome to the presidency present to whoever wins the next election. Come January, I think you can expect the North Koreans to do something to get our attention. well before a new administration is ready. So you can expect a January crisis or a January offer of some kind by the North Koreans, but expect the North Koreans to demand attention, either from a second Trump administration or a new Biden administration. Neither will be ready when that happens. All I'm going to say about this is we'll talk about this a little later. Everybody hates the idea of containment, but if you believe that DPRK is a rational actor, and I do, it may not be our logic, but they are rational in their own terms, it gives us the long-term advantage, because if we can stabilize this thing, short of war, in the long run, we and the South Koreans have all the advantages. But if we're wrong, of course, we've given the North Koreans a huge thing to threaten us with. So it's a tough call for whoever comes in next. Here are my recommendations to anybody who wants to know what can we do with the North Koreans. And you say we can't get everything we want, so what can we do? Well, there are a dozen things I think we could get if we want to stop halfway. We could get them to stop producing nuclear material. So we know that their arsenal isn't going to grow anymore. We could get a firm halt to any testing of ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. That way, they can't be sure their missiles are going to be capable of reaching us with what they've tested so far. They need more testing. That's always a long pole in the tent for a nuclear weapons program, is missile testing. It takes a lot. You got to have a lot of failures before you know you're going to succeed. We could get a shutdown of specific facilities, although we don't know all their facilities, so that's a little tricky, that one. I think we can do a peace treaty and some sanctions relief in return for these kinds of things. In particular, there's something that's fairly cost-free to us. All we have to do in the sanctions area is allow the South Koreans to go forward with the kind of economic engagement they want to go forward with the North Koreans. It costs us nothing. It does. It's lucrative for the North Koreans. The South Koreans want to do it because they think there's a road forward to reunification over the long term here. I don't agree with them, but they think that. So there's a cost-free way for us. We can get something of this for other people's money. So I think that's useful. We also need to do something. We need mechanisms to prevent accidental war. If North Korea is going to have a nuclear weapons program, what we don't want is an itchy trigger finger on their side, worried that that's something, any incident that happens, they've got to push the button right away. And that's where they are today. They are a first-use country. They know that if they wait around for the war, we're going to take them out. So they're going to want to use their weapons early, and we want to do something here to keep that from being, from them doing it either by accident or by misinterpreting information. So those are the kinds of things I think are available to the next administration. There's a halfway house here to stabilize this situation short of war. And then from there, once we have stabilized the relationship, to start working slowly towards a future where denuclearization is something the North Koreans can think about without thinking about that Saddam Hussein noose around their neck. But that's going to take time. That's going to take experience with us. They're going to have to see that an agreement with us can work. Now, just to wrap up, the problem is worse today than it was, and the solution set is smaller. The window's closed until next year for a solution. And we're not likely to be able to easily step back from symmetry to what the Obama administration conducted with North Korea. The Obama administration basically concluded that, with the North Koreans, we have to expend a huge amount of political capital to get anywhere with them. And we're putting that capital into the Iran deal. We just can't, they're just so hard to get anywhere with. It's just not worth the effort. So let's put sanctions on them and have what we called strategic patience. We'll wait them out and hope something good happens in the future. Once we've broken the symmetry barrier now. So how do you go back from that? I don't know that you can. I don't think we can go back to what the previous Democratic administration did. And I believe that is where the Biden people who were in the Obama administration think they're going to go. They're going to put sanctions on again and hope that the North Koreans see reason someday. And I don't think that's possible. I don't think sanctions alone are the answer anymore. I don't think they can get us where we need to go. But the thing I would suggest to any administration before January 21st is you start getting diplomatic signals to the North Koreans that we know they're there. They're going to be high on our list to do something with. So let's not blow it by creating an incident that takes us to a confrontation early in administration. That's something I would say to the Trump people, and I'd say it to the Biden people. Get a message to these guys prior to the inauguration. With that, I hope I've given you something of value to consider. I'd love to get some questions on this. There's a lot of stuff I couldn't cover in the amount of time I had. I want to thank you for your patience, and I will get the screen off so we can see each other again.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you very, very much. That was a terrific talk. First question is, what do you think is the least amount that North Korea would give up if we were to go to negotiations?
The least, well, the least is nothing. I mean, they'd be happy to give up nothing for everything. But I think what we know what we can achieve one thing, which is the shutdown of the Yongbyon nuclear center. Now, we've been down that road before with North Korea. They've frozen it. They've stopped it during the Bush administration. They stopped it during the Clinton administration, and it gets restarted. So when we say dismantle, we would have to mean dismantle. There are a couple of facilities in there that's worthwhile to do. So it's really a question on our side of, for that minimum offer, what could we give them? And that would be a controversial issue inside the U.S. government. But I think that's the minimum we will see. Now, I think the problem with that is it leaves facilities that can keep increasing their nuclear weapons capability untouched. Those are outside the Yongbyon facility. We don't know them all. I think the U.S. government and the intelligence community think they know some, but my experience with our intelligence knowledge of North Korea is I'm sure we're missing something. So if you just take that offer, you know there's something out there that's going to do you harm, and you haven't touched it in the agreement.
So to follow up on that question, what do you think given the political divide in this country, what do you think a U.S. future administration would actually be able to do?
Yeah. Here, I think this is a sad commentary. In the political sphere, opponents of any deal with North Korea have basically won the day. I mean, the bumper sticker knowledge that everybody has about the North Koreans is A, they're crazy, B, they'll cheat and lie on any agreement. That's what everybody believes. So why would we give them anything? Because they're going to lie and cheat anyway. And that's not my experience. I mean, they do cheat on occasion, and we've caught them on occasion. But I've also seen them keep agreements. I've seen them implement agreements. You can negotiate something that's of interest to you and get something good out of it. I've done it. My superiors have done it. So there's something there, but that's not the sort of the conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom is these guys are going to cheat, so there's nothing you can do with them. Number one. Number two, there's a belief, there's this, it's so easy when you're outside the negotiation to come up with a maximal position, which would be so much better than what people have actually negotiated. So when Trump was in the middle of symmetry, lots of critics from both parties were coming forward to say, but he didn't do anything about human rights. Unless they do everything, unless they change their human rights performance, we shouldn't do anything on nuclear weapons. Or he didn't get everything from, we think they're going to cheat, so he's got to do X, Y, and Z before we give up anything to the North Koreans. And that was bipartisan. So I don't think actually the usual divide plays with North Korea, because everybody's opposed to North Korea. This is one of the few bipartisan things that happens. If you put a sanctions bill up on North Korea, you'll get 99 votes in the Senate. So it's one of the few things where you'll always get bipartisan support. So I think one of the advantages of a Trump summitry was that it took out it took away the ability of the more hardline members of Congress and in the commentariat of saying, here's another weak-kneed Democratic, giveaway to a dictator. This was going to be something from the right, and therefore that was able to mute some of the criticism. I think a Biden administration is going to have a tough time. I think I couldn't advise them to put this first on their agenda because it's going to take a lot of political capital. It's going to take a lot of political capital, and I think it would make them politically very vulnerable. So your point is well taken. In a sense, it's too bad that the Trump summitry didn't produce a result already, and I think it's going to be very tough now for either a president of either party to come up with the kind of deal you'll need. That said, I think an interim deal would be okay. Where past administrations have gotten into trouble was when they've offered sort of tangible benefits to North Korea paid for by the American taxpayer. That really sticks in people's craw. That's what got the Clinton administration in trouble. So I think there's, if you could tell people that we're going to get rid of North Korean ICBMs targeted at us, they're going to be willing to, I think, be supportive of an agreement. At least, that's my view on this. But the politics isn't great.
The next question, and I'm going to combine two of them here because I think they come together, is where does China stand with regard to some of the options mentioned? In other words, what could we hope to have China help us do in this regard?
Yeah.
And then the same question with respect to the Republic of Korea or South Korea.
Okay, I have two very good questions. The role of China is a big one. So let's talk about that first. North Korea is China's only formal ally in the entire world. They have one ally, North Korea. North Korea is totally dependent on China for its oil supplies. Over 90% of its foreign trade is with China. It gets lots of food aid from China. North Koreans go into China and work in Chinese sweatshops and produce lots of foreign exchange for North Korea. So North Korea has a big dependency on China for a lot of things, and it doesn't like it. I mean, I think there's two pieces here. First, they're very dependent on China. So China has a lot of leverage, but they hate the fact they're dependent on China, and the relationship between them is not subservient. North Koreans can be really nasty in going back and forth with China. Right now, they're in a warm phase for a couple of reasons. Okay, so China's got a lot of leverage, and in the Bush administration in particular, and a little bit less in the Obama administration, there was a lot of effort to say, China solved this problem for us. Put the pressure on these guys, grab them by the throat, and get them to get rid of their nuclear weapons. And the Chinese would never do it. And here's the reason why. For China, North Korea's nuclear weapons are the third bad thing that can come out of Korea, not the first. Number one for North Korea is that there's a war, a second Korean War on China's border, producing a huge security threat to China. So number one, they don't want a Korean War again. Number two is the collapse of North Korea, which would have two really bad impacts on China. The first is they'd get all the refugees that would come pouring in from a collapsed North Korean state. The second one is it would mean the collapse of an Asian communist regime right next to China. And as we can see about China these days, one thing they do not want is anything that could question the stability of Asian communist regimes like theirs. So they're not prepared to solve bad thing 3 if it's going to produce bad thing 1 or bad thing 2. So we are at cross purposes in terms of what our priorities are on the Korean Peninsula. For China, a diplomatic solution that just keeps this damn thing quiet for the next 20 years is perfectly acceptable. So what can we expect from China? Well, prior to our collapse of our relations with China in the last couple of years, we could at least expect them to give lip service to sanctions and to kind of encourage the North Koreans not to be completely nuts in their nuclear and missile testing. And they used to do that. And they would, from time to time, put some pressure on the North Koreans to get them to be more reasonable. Now, since our relationship with China is sort of disastrously bad, I don't think you can expect anything from them. As far as they're concerned, the world is a zero-sum game now. And North Korea is a chip on their side of the table, and they're not doing anything to give up any chips on their side of the table. So I think now you're going to see the Chinese be pretty obstructive to any effort we have to solve this problem. And that's, at least in part, a self-inflicted wound. The ROK. One of the great frustrations for both American and South Korean diplomats is, how we do North Korean policy. It always seems we're out of phase. If the South Koreans want to engage with North Korea, we want to put pressure on them. And when we're trying to engage with the North Koreans, the South Koreans want to put pressure on them. They're worried about getting abandoned all of a sudden. So we're always at cross purposes. Even though we're allies, we don't really sing from the same sheet of music very often. And that's always a problem. That produces grit in the wheels for both of us. Currently, the South Korean president is very heavily engagement oriented. So for a while, we were on the same sheet of music. But it's always tough to keep us all in sync. And the North Koreans, of course, are playing us. They try to keep us divided that way. So when they're not being nice to us, they're nasty to the South Koreans, and we'll give them the time of day. And then when we're being nasty to them, they're lovely to the South Koreans to try to keep things from the alliance from coalescing. Now, the South Koreans have the resources to reward North Korea should we ever get to a denuclearization deal or a halfway house. They are the ones who have the big benefits to offer. They're willing to put a lot of money and effort and projects into engagement with North Korea. So it's very valuable when we're on the same sheet of music. And certainly that, given again the fraying of our Asian alliances, that's going to be, I think, one of the first priorities for any administration if they want to go at the Korean problem. We're going to have to make sure we're thinking this through with the South Koreans.
So the follow-up to that, and to continue with that, is why not then help North Korea develop their economy? Link them into the global trade economy, and perhaps start that with South Korea, with the ROK. That's
if you believe in sort of long-term, normalization of North Korea, that's the right answer. That's the South Korean view. Right there is that's South Korean policy. We bring them into the global trade regime. We bring them into prosperity. We give them a stake in stability and in peace. The problem with that is the North Koreans say, yeah, we want a stake in peace. We want $3 billion from you, and don't ask us where it went. The regime has a 50-year, 60-year history of extracting benefits from foreigners, and not providing the commensurate change of policy. So, and that's, the Chinese faced that, the Russians faced that with them, we faced it with them in the Clinton administration. It's the school book answer. It's the right answer if you believe there is a way to make peace. The problem is the regime is a pretty nasty, extractive bunch of guys, and I'm not sure you can make it work.
So that the next two, and I'm going to kind of link these together because I think it makes sense to link them together because they're both kind of technical in nature. The first one is, if the North Koreans were to actually target some position in the US, and you can pick whatever target you would like, what's the likelihood they would be able to hit it with any sort of accuracy?
Yeah.
So that's question number one. And question number two is there any potential technical solution to North Korea's ballistic nuclear weapons stockpile, that you see as promising? Is there some technical magic bullet out there?
A magic bullet? No, well, yeah, okay. The first one, North Korea's missiles aren't sort of known for being, pinpoint accurate. They've gotten a lot of help lately from somebody. Their generation of intercontinental ballistic missiles doesn't flow from what they did before. So they may be more accurate than past ones. But look, they haven't tested them very much. They haven't tested their RVs at all. So are they very accurate? No. I mean, if I'm a military commander worried about protecting a military unit, I'm not too worried. I mean, if I'm an air base commander, I'm worried. But in terms of pinpoint accuracy, where you've got to get down to 200 yards or 100 yards or 50 yards to take it out with a nuclear weapon, no, I'm not worried about that. However, now that they've produced a thermonuclear weapon with a 200 kiloton yield, they can probably do the job. They can, especially since they're probably going to, in the United States, going to target soft targets. They're not going to go after hardened military targets. They're going to hit cities. And chances are, with a thermonuclear weapon, they're going to get close enough to a city to kill a lot of people. I mean, for my own purposes, when they were doing the missile testing, I was, using one of the web, what damage will a nuclear weapon do if it lands near you? And I was using one for the Pentagon because I live a mile from the Pentagon. So if the North Koreans were targeting the Pentagon and they were using a 20 kiloton weapon, well, chances are they weren't going to get the Pentagon. And they might not do much damage to me because they might overshoot, undershoot. We might be okay. Once you go to a thermonuclear weapon, I'm not sure the Pentagon's going to be there, but I know I'm not. They're with that bigger weapon, they can make up for some of their accuracy problems. And their accuracy is getting better and will get better with more testing. Thus, the reason I want to get testing banned if I can. Magic bullet, no magic bullets on their nuclear weapons. The hardest thing to do in arms control is to find a warhead. There's no, I can find a reprocessing plant. I can find other things, where they're producing plutonium. I can find other things. But a warhead's small. It's going to be a small thing. It can be hidden anywhere. It can be shielded, so you're not going to get radiation off of it that you can detect. No, you can't. There's going to be a magic bullet here. Now, there are things we can do to sort of reduce the risk. At a 30 weapon arsenal, you've got to think about missile defense. And I think we have been thinking a lot about missile defense. So with the South Koreans, for example, and our own continental missile defense, with fairly crude weapons and a limited number of them, ballistic missile defense makes some sense. We can probably do a lot to keep us from total harm. I would argue that if they only have 30 nuclear weapons, I have some faith that we're not going to see the devastation of the United States of America with North Korean nuclear weapons, between ballistic missile defense and the fact that our military will act rather quickly at anything that isn't launched immediately. We're probably going to be hurt, but not catastrophically. I can't say that for South Korea and Japan. I mean, they're going to have 1,000 missiles to launch. We're not going to know which ones have the nuclear warheads on them. And I don't, we have no ballistic missile defense for 1,000 missiles. So, from a regional and military perspective, there's no magic bullet. The way you stop a North Korean nuclear attack from doing anything is you destroy North Korea today. Then they won't have anything to launch, sure, but then you've committed a war crime, and you've probably created a world that you don't want to live in afterwards. So no, sorry, no magic bullets.
The last question for the evening. Obviously, we've had strained relations between China and the U.S. We've had strained relations between China and Japan. If they continue to degrade and perhaps reach a crisis point, how do you think the North Koreans might respond to a Chinese and a U.S. buildup in the region?
I think this is a gut reaction. I haven't thought this through. I haven't studied it. I think they try to duck. They say, you guys, we've seen you guys, people like you, fight before. You stay out of our turf. Stay out of our turf. We're not part of this. I can't see them, rising in socialist solidarity with their allies. I think I basically look at the Chinese and say, well, you got in this mess. We're staying out of it if we can. As I've basically said in many of these talks, North Koreans do not care a fig about other countries. They don't care at all. They're the center of the universe as far as they're concerned, and they don't have any sense of global responsibility. They don't have any sense of socialist responsibility. They don't have any sense. They're in it for themselves, and so my guess is they would try to duck, unless they were the precipitating cause of U.S.-Chinese tension. I think they would want to be out of the way. If that's the last question, I just want to thank everybody for their attention. And I suppose, Duncan, if anybody has follow-ups, I'll be happy to answer later.
Sure. Thank you very much. This was absolutely terrific. Terrific talk, terrific set of questions and answers. So thank you very much for that. Quick announcement. Our next webinar is November 2nd. The speaker will be Dr. Richard Haass, who's the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, and the topic will be World History, what drives various regions of the world, the challenges of globalization, the most influential countries, events, and ideas, and what the U.S. and our allies and partners can do going forward to try and ensure continued American security and prosperity. So until then, and until next time, again, Ambassador DeThomas, thank you. And to everyone else, thank you for joining us. Take care, and most of all, be safe and healthy.
Everybody have a great night.